There we go. Let's try it now. Okay. So sorry about the no audio, folks. So let's get down to it. Let's talk a little bit about romance. Romance in, not genre romance, but romance in other genres here. So one of the things that I really wanted to talk about when it comes to genre romance, or not genre romance, but romance inside of other genres, is just, okay. Can you hear me now? Because I have like a big delay on the chat. So I'm hearing people spamming that they can't hear me now. Okay, so now we can hear me. All right, good. This is going to be like a bad one for the replays, but whatever. We'll work with it. As you missed my little intro spiel, let me go ahead and start over again. Okay. Seeing as it's Valentine's Day tomorrow, I thought I'd do a stream on romance or romantic relationships within fiction in various media. That includes movies, comics, books. Romance is usually outside of genre romance, which I'm not going to really talk about because I don't read genre romance and I don't write genre romance. But you can learn lessons from genre romance because the main focus is actually the relationships. So you can learn some of the lessons from that and apply them to other genres. But I'm not going to really talk that much about it. I'm going to talk about how it usually functions in other things. Romance is one of those things that it's usually relegated to what's called a B story. You have an A story, which is your main plot, a B story, which is usually a romance if there's going to be a romance, and then you have a C story, which is some other secondary thing which helps solve problems from A and B. That's the way that you typically write a screenplay, and a lot of books follow that format as well. Usually the romance is something that happens alongside the main plot or happens and develops while the main plot is happening rather than having its own set of events and its own trajectory. It's usually something that happens primarily through dialogue and happens a little bit in the margins. Now, the problem with writing romance in general, I mean, this would probably be true even for genre romance or perhaps even more so. The same execution of a set of character relationships can be really effective for one type of audience and completely ineffective for another. Or even within the same audience that likes the same genre, you can have a romance be a total miss, or you can have it be a big hit, and it just depends on who's receiving that. And I feel like there's a lot more uncertainty when it comes to the effectiveness of romance, just in general, compared to other types of stories or other plot elements that you have. Like if you have an execution of a thriller, that can be very, very effective to a high degree for a large percentage of your audience. But a romance may be hit or miss. Even something that is considered very classic with romances, like Casablanca or something like that, you may find that people find it just boring and dull and it doesn't hit. Or people think of like Han Solo and Leia as being an effective romance, and then at the same time other people don't. Or a romance from Star Wars, we go to the prequels between Anakin and Amidala there. I found it very not effective, and other people are like, well, I really found it very effective. So it depends. It's so dependent on who's receiving it. You can't say with a lot of certainty exactly how you got to execute it. But there's a couple things that I've noticed when it comes to executing romance that I think can be helpful if you're thinking about having a romance subplot. Before I go further, one of the reasons that romance is a subplot and not usually the main plot, unless you're doing genre romance, and even then it's kind of the B story more often than not. One of the reasons that it's relegated to a B story status is because it is so hit and miss. And if you put all of your eggs, you put all of your weight on making that romance be very effective, and it doesn't hit with a big portion of your audience, you may be really in some trouble as far as how your audience receives it. I think you can see this with some of the Wheel of Time books in the fantasy genre, is that once they start getting into romance, like especially in the middle books, like books 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, those romances can be very hit or miss. And you talk to some fans and they're like, I hated Fail, I loved Fail. There's like everybody has a completely different opinion about it. Some people don't buy any of the romances. Some people buy all of them. Some people just don't want romance in their fantasy genre fiction. It really just depends on the audience member that's reading it. And certain genres, romance is really kind of far in the back. If you're writing something like grimdark fantasy, it's probably a little further in the back than it's going to be in something like young adult fantasy. Young adult as a umbrella of genres, a romance is almost mandatory. It's essential, almost like it's an expected thing to occur in every single story, is to have some sort of romance or romantic subplot. In fact, that's one of the main focuses, I guess, of young adult fiction is romance. And I think a lot of it has to do with like who we are as individuals, right? As you get older, like I am a little bit, romance plots are just not as interesting because romance in my life is a little bit different, right? I married, children, right? Those things change the way that you view romance, and also the fact that you're very secure with your relationship. You live less vicariously through characters that are more uncertain with their romantic relationships. So before I get into a couple of things that I noticed about some different ways to execute romance between characters, let's take a look at the chat. And before I get to the chat, in the main channel, let me look at some stuff from Twitter. First thing, somebody says, Blue Acre on Twitter, love scenes. I'm going to do love scenes, if only for the cringe factor. I'll talk about love scenes in a little bit, which basically means sex scenes, right? Though I suppose avoiding cringe factor is an important lesson. Terry Goodkind's Wizard's First Rule was the last of his books I read, partly due to unoriginality and inconsistency, but also off-putting S&M romance. So Wizard's First Rule I've read, and it's okay. The romance in it, I think he was really, I don't know if he was really influenced by Ayn Rand or not, but Ayn Rand always had this extreme sort of dominance and almost violent undertone to sex scenes, and that exists in Terry Goodkind, and Terry Goodkind, I think, considers himself an objectivist. So I don't know why certain personality types end up having to put a lot of S&M type of stuff into romance, but some people really like it, obviously, because 50 Shades of Grey was a bestseller. Some people really like more aggressive things in there, but a fantasy audience may not respond to that, and I think there's a lesson there for sure. And especially if you're reading something like that, and it's kind of obvious that the author is explaining his or her fantasy. Like I've said, in any scene, an author is going to tell you what they know, what they don't know, and what they long for. And so sex scenes are kind of like torture scenes, in that they show what the author knows, what they don't know, and then what they long for. So I think sometimes with Terry Goodkind's sex scenes, I feel like he's showing a sex scene that he longs for a little bit, but hasn't experienced himself. Versus some writers write from a place of experience, and it tends to be a little more fluid. But I'll talk about some certain things about romance and sex scenes is that the audience tends to desire things which are not realistic. And that's an important thing to know about as well. The audience usually doesn't want boring vanilla relationships that develop without tension, and because story tension is every part of story, the relationship has to have tension as well. But also they tend to not want, so people that declare themselves to be feminists, or women that declare themselves to be feminists, will then read literature with romances that are heavily male dominant. And there's a dissonance there, which is what sometimes what people say they want, or what they actually may choose in real life. For a fantasy, they actually choose the exact opposite. And deep down, they actually want something that's more male dominant, I suppose. So it's an interesting lesson there. Here, let's look at some of the channel chat here. From Glitchy Gear, a recent conversation I've had is about performance romance versus intimate romance, and how we hated that most B-plot romances are very performative and not too intimate. Thoughts? I don't know what performative versus intimate means in this context. Usually because it's in a B story, you have to just show it happening as you go along, and there's a couple ways that they tend to execute that. Versus something that happens through intimacy. This is the way that love actually develops, like in your real life. You don't so we write stories that are in many ways the opposite of what is necessary to experience in real life. So you write a romance where boy and girl meet, they have immediate tension with each other. That tension somehow evolves into sexual chemistry that but the tension's still there. It has to be relieved through like sex or matriculation of the relationship. That's not really how romance develops. Or you meet someone and you immediately love them, right? Real love tends to develop through shared experiences. And so it's slow and it's about developing intimacy. And the truth is that when we're looking at a lot of characters, just depending on how the book's written and the genre, we may or may not want to be too intimate with the characters because what's the old thing? Familiarity breeds contempt. Being deeply intimate with the flaws of characters can sometimes make them off-putting. It depends. So you tend to have a lot of caricatures, or you have the flat facade of characters tend to interact with each other. So it's like that. Another conversation I've had is how modern writers often feel they need a romance to make the story more mainstream, and how is that a negative influence on modern media? Thoughts? It's very obvious when they wedge in a romance where none was and none belongs. Excellent example is the Hobbit movies. They decided that they were going to create some sort of love triangle between Legolas, this like hot redheaded girl elf, which if you follow Vox Day, the fact that she has red hair would probably say something in itself. Like he has some analysis about the way writers tend to choose hair colors for the female characters that reflects like their attitude towards women. But anyway, that, and then a dwarf, right? Now, a romance between an elf and a dwarf is farcical, like in Tolkien's worldview. Like they wouldn't be attracted to one another in like really any way, shape, or form. They're different species. It would be like you being into an alien, right? Like they do that in Star Trek all the time. That probably wouldn't happen. But it's wedged in there hard, and you can feel how awkward it is, that it doesn't belong in the story, and they have to create events that go with that romance rather than the romance developing through the plot. So a much more natural romance is one, like Han and Leia. That happens through the plot. Han and Leia are just in proximity as they're doing all these other actions that they both need to accomplish, and the romance happens through that. Whereas when you have this, I don't remember which elf it was. It was Feely and I don't know what. I remember they made up a girl elf. They have to add all of these things in, and it's very obvious that they're not happening organically within the normal flow of the narrative, because the original narrative included no romance. Tolkien didn't include a romance because a bunch of dudes going on an adventure for treasure they may find romance, but that's not their goal. And especially if they're dwarves and hobbits, no one from their own species is even around for them to romance, right? Likewise, you have the same thing in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, actually. So Peter Jackson did it again, and I think he did it to be more mainstream. That it's like we got to have some kind of romance sea story involved in this. So they added a bunch of scenes between Aragorn and Arwen. Now, those scenes in some ways did exist in Lord of the Rings, although in the appendices and not in the main narrative, and it becomes really obvious that they kind of put those in. But still, it was done better than it was in The Hobbit, because unlike in The Hobbit, there actually was a romance between Aragorn and Arwen. They did get married at the end of the story. They did matriculate somehow within that, and there was something important about their relationship because of the relationship between Elrond and Aragorn and the Dunedain people, So there was a relevancy to it that even though the way it was executed in those Lord of the Rings movies is kind of awkward, it's still more relevant than it was in The Hobbit. And it was just there to try to like amp up some extra emotion. And this was completely superfluous and awkward. It fell flat. It was just a terribly done romance, especially in the fantasy genre. And if they had cut that entirely out of those movies, if they had cut all the crap they added out of the Hobbit movies, you would have had one probably really good movie. Instead, you got 3 very mediocre to bad movies. That's a lesson for another day, but the romance lesson is there. I don't think you need to add romance, but it depends on your genre. If you're writing in the young adult genre, romance is very expected, and so because it's so expected, because it's such an expectation, it might be a necessity. It would be like trying to write a metal album without guitar in it. Like, you could do it. In fact, bands have done it, but it's not really the rule. And so if you really wanted to go with the rule, you're going to need some kind of romance. But for fantasy and science fiction, you don't need a romance subplot. You can put one in there if you want, but it's probably better if it's done through character interaction kind of organically as the plot goes, rather than just creating its own set of events. From Jared, how do you write romance into your story to make sure it's not over the top, melodramatic, or cliched, regardless of the medium one is writing? Okay. Let me think about that one for a second. Just as a by the way, if you really want my attention, so I know that you're not responding to another person, make sure you write my name, David Stewart, and I'll know that the chat is from a person who's actually watching the chat, and not someone responding to someone else. So that's really what I'm talking about, is how do you do it so it's not over the top, melodramatic, or cliched. So the main thing is you want people to talk like people. And so if you've never experienced romance, which all of us probably have on some level, then you'd have a hard time writing it. But most people have. So you just have to kind of go with the things you said and the things you felt when you experienced it. And that's a great place to start. If you set up character types so that they have the right amount of tension within a romantic development, and tension is really what drives romance. If you think about something like Ross and Rachel from Friends, why was that a thing? It was a thing because they weren't getting together. So the longer you prolong the matriculation of a relationship, the more tense and interesting it becomes to a reader. That's just a general thing. So if you pick personality types that will prolong that tension, like with Ross and Rachel, you have one who's, very, I don't want to say, she was a promiscuous, kind of outgoing, sanguine woman. And the other one was a more reserved, kind of beta male. Obviously, he's going to have a hard time actually figuring out how to make that work, right? So that creates tension. But you kind of root for them because you like different things about each character. As soon as they had them get together, they had to break them up, because with the tension gone from the relationship, it's no longer interesting. And so it's the tension that makes it interesting. So if you pick personality types that can create that a little bit, like, so if you have, if you have a really, like, one of the things that tends to be picked in some genres is a woman who's very demure, or maybe even a little socially awkward, maybe even a little bit, I don't know what the word is here, just a little bit not on top of it socially, a little bit afraid of talking to the male. That tends to be a set of attractive qualities for men who are reading it. And the women can also kind of experience that female character a little bit vicariously, because everybody has felt awkward. Everybody's felt a little bit unable to communicate their feelings properly. Everybody's maybe wanted the attention of somebody that's a little bit out of their league. And so when you have that, those sorts of personalities work together, then it creates its own natural tension that can then be resolved through some character growth. So the female character can gain a little bit more confidence to talk about it. The male character could be less oblivious to it and, learn to gain some intimacy with this person who shows that she cares about him. And so that's a typical like rom-com thing, is where, you have maybe an alpha kind of male who's interested in a more like alpha female, and then his attention turns to the more demure woman because of her better virtues and things like that. So super chat for $50. Thank you so much, Shenlong. I really appreciate it. I don't have a question, just thank you for your videos. Well, thank you for the $50. I really do appreciate it, and I appreciate everybody watching. And I appreciate people dropping in for the streams and asking questions, because it keeps it very interesting. I will tell you about romance. I don't necessarily feel like I'm the best writer for romances, but I try to avoid cringing. So I kind of learned via negativa. And the first books that I wrote had romance in them, and it was very poorly done. And so I learned all the rules that I broke, and I learned how to set up, relationships in the future that avoid that. Just as an example, so in Needle Ash, there's no romance in this one, right? The romance already existed. It's Helga and her husband. They already had a romance, right? But in this one, there's a romance that develops. And it develops by starting with characters that are not compatible with each other, really, right? They kind of, the main character, Michael, he's kind of annoyed by Sharona, who's this mage from his army. And he finds her a little bit annoying. He can't really get rid of her. He doesn't understand her or what she wants. She's very enigmatic, but not in a way that makes sense to him. He wants things to be plain and straightforward. He's a warrior. He doesn't like subtlety. And through the course of the book, they end up kind of figuring out how to actually tell each other how they feel, and he actually begins to appreciate her actual virtues, because they're not virtues that he's used to appreciating. And so that way you have a little bit of a tension in it, and the relationship finally matriculates about 2/3 of the way through the story. Now, if I were really on top of it, I would only have it matriculate like towards the very end. But by doing it 2/3 of the way through, I got to add some more tension and kind of pull them physically apart from each other for a little while to make the final conclusion be a little bit better. So that's the way I executed that one. In Muramasa, there is, I think I have a copy of Muramasa here for you. I did. The two main characters in this, they have a somewhat professional relationship, and you can kind of sense that they really do care for each other through most of the story, but they don't really, because it's not really something that would be allowed because of their difference in stations. You have that forbidden love angle, and so that ends up becoming a source of tension that has to be resolved through plot. So that one was done, and again, it develops just mostly through them talking. So if you talk to somebody enough, you get to learn things about them, and you get to know them, and you interact with the person through the plot, and eventually, intimacy develops, I suppose. Okay, let me keep reading because I'm probably way behind here. From Jack Cool, the only romance I've done was a space nun in a space knight. They have a secret affair, survive a huge battle together, and then retire from those jobs to get married. See, that's great. So the secret affair, that's a forbidden love angle. And forbidden love is very enticing to people. A lot of times love stories, romance, and sex, these get kind of bound up in approaches to sin, and also what we view as acceptable socially or not. So if a nun and a priest are going to have an affair, that's like a forbidden love thing. If a man falls in, like Sound of Music, she's a nun, or she's going to be a nun, I think. So there's a certain forbidden love angle to that. So when it matriculates, it's all the more satisfying. When it finally begins for real, it becomes a lot more satisfying of a conclusion. But people are very interested in forbidden love. I think the romance genre operates with forbidden love as like a main theme. So if it's a stable boy and a princess, right? If you watch The Princess Bride, it's about forbidden love. So differences in social stations that make it forbidden, right? Differences in in race or religion that make it forbidden. Aladdin is fundamentally about forbidden love. So forbidden love is a really, really common thing. So if you create two characters that have some sort of difference that would make their relationship unprofessional or bad on some level, then it has a little bit more of an enticing effect. Now, genre romance will take this to another level. So rather than it being like, a princess and a stable boy, it'll be like, a teacher and a student, right? Like a college professor and his student, or something even more forbidden. They tend to do things that are even crazier like that, right? Depending on which character wants to be dominant or not. So forbidden love is a really, really good angle, and that's an easy way to get people interested in a relationship. In fact, that's probably the most common trope of all romances that I see in fiction. It's just constantly used. It's really rare that you have two characters have like develop a romantic relationship at the same station with the same values as each other, with the same goals as each other. It's pretty rare. Muramasa, it almost does that, but there's a little bit of a difference in station, and their relationship is formal, so it's not supposed to happen, and then they kind of make it happen there. How do you make a B-plot romance that's not shallow? Well, you have to have the characters actually have a certain amount of intimacy, or have the love have some real risk and impact to it. What's very common in young adult, which a lot of times romance tends to feel shallow, is like you put in a romance because you feel like you need to have it, and this happens in every genre. People don't have a real reason to be interested in each other. They don't really know each other, and so it just kind of feels like it's happening because people's physical bodies are able to line up with each other, not so much because they have any reason to begin it. And it's all about tension. So the more tension and the longer that tension rides out, the less shallow it's really going to feel. I'm working on a sci-fi story, and was thinking of having an offbeat romance between the two main characters, one a crackpot human male and the other a gelatinous alien that can't keep it in its pants. See, I'm not so sure about aliens, right? That would be rather bizarre. That might be funny, and some people might be into it. But as soon as you get to like really fetishy, kitschy kind of stuff, you start cutting into your audience, right? So the more general and easy to understand the romance, the easier it is to make your audience happy. If you're writing stuff that's like very fetishized, especially in non-fetish romance genres, you're gonna put off a lot of people. And then Film Girl says, how do you write a believable romance? Well, the characters have to be believable with themselves and have to have some believable reason to be with each other. That's my belief. So a lot of times you just put characters, so like a typical, I guess they call it chick lit. I didn't create the name, so if you feel insulted by them calling something chick lit, that's just what it's called. Like, we'll call it romantic comedy literature. And you see this in romantic comedy movies and things like that, which is generally light stories that are primarily about romance. You have characters that start off hating each other and then have to resolve their difficulties through physical intimacy, and then somehow that sticks, right? That to me doesn't really become believable. What becomes believable is people finding a reason to actually care about one another. And that usually means that people are going to be discovering virtue about the other character. So in Needle Ash, it's about Michael discovers Sharona's virtue. She has a somewhat off-putting personality. She's somewhat oblivious to things. She's kind of jealous and annoying in some cases, but he realizes that not only, that those are expressions of her like very extreme devotion to him, and that extreme devotion, he ends up realizing that that's an extremely valuable thing, and that's something that he really appreciates. And then he also begins to appreciate other things about her, and other ways that she thinks. And so eventually that devotion to him opens him up towards seeing all of her other virtues, and that's how he actually becomes interested in her. And it's not because of her physical attractiveness. So one of the things I actually avoided in Needle Ash was talking a whole lot about Sharona's physical attractiveness or physical appearance. I think the only thing I used to describe her was she was a short, round-faced woman and was somewhat like full in the hips, is what I think I said at one point. Which just, I imagine she was just an average-looking girl. And I wanted a really average-looking girl because if he had met her and she was gorgeous and beautiful and he was immediately obsessed with her, then that meeting of that relationship would not have been as effective. It wouldn't have been about them coming to love each other and their virtues. It would have just been about, an immediate physical desire somehow translating into something permanent. So that's how I write something believable. So I can really talk about how I look at it and how I do it. And I did the same thing in Muramasa. I did the exact same thing. It's about those two characters learning to know each other and to care about each other, and in some cases, see each other's significant flaws and choose to love each other anyway. So I think the further away romance gets from characters' virtues and their personalities, the less believable it is. And the closer you are to their personalities as you write them and their virtues and how those two fit together, the more believable it is. And this is one of the things they do with romances. They tend to write very diverse characters that should never be together. They somehow end up together because that's where the story tension comes from. You have beta male Ross and you have, promiscuous Rachel. And of course they're not going to work together, right? Of course it's not going to work out. Ross isn't even really beta. He's like gamma, right? He's almost like an incel. He's married to a lesbian, or he was married to a lesbian. So trying to get those two together, of course it's not going to work. Whereas if it had been like, Ross was just a little bit, he was like a Chandler. He was more of a beta guy, just a normal dude, right? If he'd been more of a normal dude, we would have accepted it a lot more, but it would have had less tension. Now it's like I'm talking about Friends on a literature stream, but everybody's seen Friends and everybody knows that, and it's a good example of how they kept the audience super interested in it. A lot of people kept tuning into Friends not because the jokes were good, but because they cared about what the characters were doing, and that's really important. I read Piers Anthony. I'm going to read this because it's a good one, from Jefferson Johnson. I read Piers Anthony, then I read Terry Goodkind, then I read George R.R. Martin. Then I wondered why so many fantasy authors are into rape. So again, what you know, what you don't know, and what you long for, right? So they're either, when they write that kind of stuff, they know that it's racy and forbidden, but they're probably not thinking about how it's actually effective as something that enriches characters and makes people super interested in the story other than titillating them, especially George R.R. Martin. George R.R. Martin, in fact, I'm going to add one more to the list. It's not rapey, but it's very, very gamma-y, is Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. It's like he writes romance that's completely ridiculous, and especially sex, where it's like, whenever you have a character that is able to miraculously please a woman the first time, you have an expression. The author's telling you about himself and his view of sex and probably his history with women as well, especially if it's a male. Female writers, I notice, don't do this, right? Because women have a little bit different attitude and experience with romance and with sex, and so they tend to not write this. If they're going to be rapey, then they're very explicit, like with 50 Shades of Grey being a male-dominant fantasy, right? Rather than the subtle difference that what you get when you have a male writer try to do this stuff. So with like Patrick Rothfuss, he'd have, this character meets this older, more experienced woman and gives her the best sex of her life the first time he ever has sex. It's like, this is pure fantasy, and it would be like the first time he picks up a sword, he cuts down his master and defeats him, right? It doesn't necessarily work that way. In fact, it most certainly doesn't. I think I was reading Prince of Thorns by Mark Lawrence, and there's a part where I think he was 13 or 14 in the book, and he's having sex with a prostitute. And the prostitute is like having the time of her life. He's giving this prostitute the best sex ever. And that scene, if you just look at it by yourself and you just look at it and you know anything about the world, or you've had any experience with anything, with sex or human beings, you'd look at that and be like, that's completely retarded. That is the dumbest thing that you could possibly write, is a 13-year-old boy giving a prostitute the best sex of her life. Like, the prostitute cares about the quality of sex. Like, it's part of this. I talked about this in the chat in the Virgin, and this video I'm certain will be demonetized during its replay because I'm talking about this. But like, this is something that gamma males do when they write sex, is they're very obsessed with the character being somehow good at sex. Whereas when you see women write romance, it's not like the skill of the physical act is not the focus, right? So you have to kind of learn from this. Like most female authors in the romance genre, in fact, I think most writers in the romance genre are female authors. The focus isn't on some sexual technique or like the guy being great at his technique and making the woman feel good, right? Feel the best ever. It's about what leads up to that. It's about the situation that creates that, and it's about the relationship between the individuals that creates that satisfying sex scene. It's not about his technique. So this is something that I think inexperienced men and men who are obsessed with sex, like incels that don't get it that often, they're so focused on this idea that they're going to please a woman by having great technique or by having a large manhood or something like that. And so if the focus is on like the size or the shape, then that that person is really thinking of it from like a frustrated male perspective. I know that that's controversial to say all that stuff, but it's something that you see come up again and again with some of these male fantasy authors. And the ones that are not like that, it's very apparent because the sex doesn't show up like that, or the sex is more downplayed. Or you just skip the sex scene and you just basically say that they had sex because it's not important how they go about doing it, right? That's not nearly as important as the relationship that creates that for as far as plot goes, as far as the story goes. And that's something interesting to think about, okay? Yeah, Jack Cool already nailed it because the authors are virgin incels who can't into romance. It's totally it. I think that's what a lot of them reveal is that they just don't know what women want and they don't know what they're actually supposed to do with a woman. Like they read genre romance and they think that that's what women want, maybe, when that's a fantasy, and that fantasy is divorced from reality as well. Let's see here. Jim Butcher at least knows he's writing for teenage dudes. Yeah, he does. And Jim Butcher really knows his audience well and does that well. Sad thing about the hobby movies is I could read the book faster than I can watch the movies, totally. And the book's better. And the dialogue's better in the book. Everything's better in the book for The Hobbit. Spending all your time crouched over a typewriter doesn't translate well into being Chad. It's true. Why do you think I didn't start writing books till I was married? Really? I don't know. Lots of people said they haven't seen Friends. Let me go back up here. I missed a bunch of stuff. I'm just gonna hop to the stuff where I'm tagged. Let's see here. What are your thoughts on an antagonist falling for the main character? Can this be done well as the eventual relationship for the main character? So I think it's great. It creates a lot of tension. But you have to think about the eventual relationship. One of them has to grow in a direction where they can have compatibility. So either the protagonist has to be more like the antagonist or the antagonist has to reform their ways. If you're doing like a bad boy thing, you can have an antagonist that's a bad boy end up falling for the main character and have that work out pretty well, because I think what tends to go along with the bad boy archetype is feeling that person being dominant and being kind of alpha, and that's attractive. And so if you can kind of set it up like that, and then it's like, oh, it'd be really nice if they got together. And you can kind of hint at compatibility early on in the story. They're alike in certain ways, and eventually, they'll come to find love. If you want to go real extreme, there's mangas and animes that do this, where they're literally trying to kill each other through most of the story until somehow they decide to have a relationship. I think it only is convincing if you can actually have them have similar virtues eventually, and then they'll like it. The film Drive really got me into the romance between the driver and his female neighbor. I think the fact that they couldn't be together was what made it most impactful. Yeah, forbidden love, or something really stopping it happening. Like maybe two people really want to be together, but there's some significant lifestyle thing that stops it from happening. Like somebody being a criminal or somebody being married, right? So that to me could be a very interesting story, is if you have somebody's married and they fall in love with someone obviously who's not their spouse, but that doesn't matriculate because they have virtue. Because there's a catch-22 there, right? So, like, you're attracted to somebody who's married. And so you're attracted to their virtue. But as soon as if they were to divorce, if the man were to divorce his wife, then one of the things that is attractive about him would go away, right? So if you're attracted to the virtue of a person, as soon as they act unvirtuously, their attractiveness diminishes. From Matrix 1, I've been watching all the Writestreams. I love all the advice. Don't stop doing them. I'm going to try to keep it going as long as I can until I really... And then if I run out of stuff to really say, then I'll just turn them into, like, let's talk about BattleTech. Let's talk about some piece of literature rather than these topics. What are your thoughts on shoujo manga and their tropes? I don't think I know enough to comment. Sorry. You made your alpha fall for the fantasy setting nerd girl. Totally. And that was kind of intentional, right? And Michael truthfully is not that alpha, right? Because he actually has some slight social difficulties in the sense that he doesn't know how to manage politics, and that's something that is a real detriment to him and gets him in a lot of trouble. But he is an extremely competent soldier. And so eventually one of the lessons he learns is that I need to not worry so much about trying to, be the great politician and just focus on my strength, which is leading my men in battle. And that's what I'll rely on to be successful. Is I'll be a good warrior, and I'll just try to figure out the politics as I go. Thoughts on harems? Ooh, what a good question. I find the good ones are done right in the genre is putting the pieces together and the main protagonist becoming more authentic individual. All right. I never really am super into them unless they're done ironically. So if you're looking at like Rosario Vampire or something like that. Now I'm going to reveal something funny about me, and maybe you guys will be shocked, maybe you won't. So back when I lived in Vegas, me and my roommate used to sit around after, we'd go to the gym, and after we were done with everything, we'd sit around and we wrote screenplays together and stuff. That roommate eventually became my brother-in-law. He married my wife's sister. But we'd sit around and we watch something, and we were watching an anime, and we would just pick like random animes to watch. And we're watching this one called Rosario plus Vampire. And we're like, what the hell are we watching? What are we watching? And about the third episode, we realized we were laughing a lot at it. And we didn't realize it was supposed to be a comedy. We were laughing at how stupid it was. And then we get to it, and we're like, who the hell was this for? And we're like, and Matt, my roommate, turns to me and he goes like, dude, this was for us, And so we would sit around, like have a drink and watch this hilarious thing. This took the harem, it was like a harem manga, harem anime, and took that and just made it completely ridiculous. So the main character he's an everyman, right? But he's so bland, and he has nothing going for him that's interesting. But all these monster girls are super into him for no reason. And I think the point where I just started laughing, and I couldn't stop laughing for 5 minutes, was there's some like little witch, and she starts conjuring wash basins, and they're like dropping on people's heads, and I'm like, what am I watching and why? And it, what made it funny was they approached that just from a completely ironic perspective, which is that here's this harem and there's no reason for it. There's no reason for any of this to be like this. And that's what made it funny. If you're talking about like people who actually try to make it serious, the tension in harem comes from like a love triangle situation. And some of the fantasy elements come from, they're intended to appeal a little bit to males. But somehow women sometimes have an appeal to harem, and I don't really know why that is. I haven't figured that one out, but maybe it just has something to do with the tension between that, like this love triangle thing. So I really have only found them amusing, like on an ironic level, but I don't seek them out. They're not things that like come across me, except when at like 4 a.m. when I'm at my apartment back this was years ago now, like 2012 or 13. So no, like 6-7 years ago. Years ago, just watching things for no reason while hanging out with my roommate. What are your thoughts on harem manga and the genre? It's appeal 15 boys 15 and older. Okay, I already answered that a little bit. So yeah, it's a fantasy directed towards males. I don't know. I've never really sought it out, but I find it funny when it's just ironic. Though I think like Rosario Vampire might have actually been effective for lots of people because it was. It might have been effective just because they didn't take itself seriously. They're like, we just have this and people like it, and so we'll just show these anime girls, and that's what people are into. Like, they don't even try to make it convincing. Race Jacobson, why can't love triangles end in poly relationships? Because people are not polyamorous by design, except like in extreme situations. I think if you have an extreme situation, you can have it be that way. A lot of authors try to write it in, like in Wheel of Time, for example. But we don't usually engage in that, so we don't really find that appropriate. Like, no, most women are not going to want to share their man, right? And most men are not going to want to share a woman. That's disgusting to most men. A woman having a second man is disgusting and degrading, right? Cuckoldry is about degrading somebody, which makes me think of Maddox, right? Let me get off on a tangent. So I watched some videos this week on Maddox. Maddox is a guy. His real name is George Aruzu or something. He had this website called The Best Page in the Universe that I read like in college and thought was funny because edgy humor that edgy just hadn't existed or hadn't been in the mainstream before then, and then it was never in the mainstream. But he sued people that were making fun of him, calling him a cuck, for $20 million, and that suit got dismissed in New York. He sued them in New York, even though everybody lived in California. Very bizarre. Anyway, so he got the suit dismissed, and then I think he has a countersuit for like malicious prosecution or something like that. Anyway, he came out with this video trying to make fun of people not calling each other cuck and not liking cuckoldry. And through that video, he exposed like his own like ridiculous attitude. Why do people call each other cuck as an insult? It's because it's like the cuckoldry fetish is about degradation. So there's probably cuckoldry fetish literature out there that's specifically about like degrading the quality of men, but you don't usually have any kind of polyamory where multiple men share a woman, at least in literature, because most men are going to find that disgusting, and from a vicarious perspective, you're putting yourself in the character's place, shameful and like and degrading. So that's why you don't usually get that. And women don't want to share men either. Like, the fantasy for women is not to share a man with another woman. It's to possess that man totally and possess all of his attention, not have to share his attention with some other woman. There's very little fantasy in like wanting a man to split his attention with you and someone else. You're not going to, if you're writing literature, you're trying to appeal to people's desires. Like, why would you write a woman having, a man having multiple women, but for a female audience? You probably wouldn't do that. You might have it for a male audience because like that's maybe a male fantasy. I want my next novel to have both a sci-fi element, AI, and fantasy. What sort of genre would this fall into? Space opera. That's easy. It'd be space opera, which is great. It's very popular. It's an exploding genre. There's tons of readers. People love it. Lots of space opera stuff. So yeah, totally. Same genre as Star Wars and all that other kind of stuff. Most sci-fi now is really space opera, not hard sci-fi. I tend to gravitate towards hard sci-fi because I like ideas, but I could write a space opera too. George Lucas isn't the best at writing dialogue, which he's admitted as such. I don't mind the romance in Attack of the Clones too much since Star Wars is space opera. Yeah, I mean, it works for different people. It didn't really work for me, but other people have told me, yeah, I dug that because I got kind of the awkwardness of Hayden Christensen worked in that relationship. It kind of made it more human. I'm like, oh yeah, I could see that. Even though that didn't work for me, I could see how that worked for someone else. Film girl has 56 dudes protecting her. Yeah. Let's see here. American Pie did this for someone that were like, da, 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 da. The concentrate on a woman's virtues and intelligence. Like if you want the romance to be appealing to men and women, especially women, right? Like you know, you want it to have some substance, right? You want it to have some substance to it, not just be like, she's hot and therefore I must have her. Unless she's like the relationship at the beginning of the novel, and then like, oh, the hot girl turns out to be annoying, you dump her for the nerdier, more virtuous, but turns out better woman in general. How do you build chemistry between characters? You have them have conversations, and you have them talk to each other. And you have a certain amount of tension and a certain amount of resolution. You have them say things to each other that they like. That's chemistry. So characters with a lot of chemistry will say and do things that the other person likes, or they'll say and do things that the other person anticipates and wishes for them. But you still have to have tension. If there's too much chemistry, there's actually not tension. The chemistry would have to happen between like, oh, they're both interested in the same thing. They're both so compatible. However, you know, he's a jerk on some level and he has to fix that. Or she's a jerk on some level, she has to fix that. Or they're in places where they can't be together and they have to fix something about their life in order to get there, right? So as long as they say things that the other person likes. Would you go see the upcoming Captain Marvel? Will you do an analysis of it? Always enjoyed. I might. I totally might. I know I totally might. I'm so committal there, right? There's so much hype around it as far as negative hype. I really would want to see it and analyze it, even though I don't want to give them money because I don't like what they're doing in the pre-release cycle, which is like really kind of hammering home the feminist angle, even though the audience is, you know, your main core audience for the Marvel movies is predominantly male. In fact, it's very, very male, and most of the money in those sorts of things is going to be from a male audience. So insulting men on the way to the box office seems like a very bad idea, and I don't want to support that. But at the same time, I like clicks, and I think it'd be interesting to see if that actually matches up with what they did. Here's a super chat from Kaku. Tragic love stories. What would be effective in rendering a good story? And what can most anticipate a very melancholic end? So, what's effective if you want to I assume by tragic love story you mean one where they don't end up together for reasons. And so I think the most effective thing is you have some compelling reason that they should be together. So there, I'll give you two things, right? So the first one, which is in my opinion harder to do and can produce a less satisfying end, but a very effective one, is two people have very strong reasons to be together. The audience really wants them to be together. However, there's something else that will stop them from being together. And to me, the most effective ones is there's some virtue that prevents it. Like what I mentioned. If you have, let's say you have two characters. Let's say you have a character and he's married, right? And, the protagonist is a female and she falls in love with him. And she really wants him. But what she's attracted to in him are the things have to do with the way that he interacts with his family, the way he interacts with his businesses and things like that. And so ultimately, she can push that, but as soon as if he were to leave his wife, that wouldn't be what he wanted. So you can either have him, like he would leave his wife and she realizes that he's a jerk and she doesn't want him anymore because now that challenges her security in her own position, or he refuses to do it, and so the relationship can never be because he's a virtuous person. The other way that you can do, besides having some sort of conflict that they decide they can't be together for, and you can think of lots of things that have that same feel, like maybe they're they're from different countries that are at war, and ultimately they decide they can't be together because the consequences of them being together would be too great. You can go the other side, which is you have one of them die. Obviously, that's going to end up really tragically. And if you want to hype up the effectiveness of the tragedy, there's a couple ways. One way is the Shakespearean ironic ending, like Romeo and Juliet, which is they die unnecessarily. Like if they had just done things a little bit differently, it'd have been okay, but they end up committing suicide or something, right? The other thing is that if you have one person like make a sacrifice for the other person that eventually leads to their death. Like if you have two characters and maybe they're, one of them, the male is a warrior, he's in the military, and he decides to make the final stand with his men and dies so that she can get away. All right. Now I know that that's a trope of male disposability, but it's, there's a lot to it, and it's very, very effective. Is that, I have to make the sacrifice for, for the city, for my people, and that means that this can't happen. That's a really effective way to create tragedy. So you could think of like 300 as having a tragic love ending, even though they're already married and the romance has already happened, and they, it's already matriculated and began. The fact that he can't have the happily ever after because he has to make a sacrifice in order for the happily ever after to happen to other people. That, to me, is very effective. So thank you for the super chat. I really do appreciate it. Some people say I have not seen Friends. Lots of people haven't seen Friends. I'm sorry I'm behind on the chat, but I want to answer everything really well. Men who don't watch Friends. I don't know. So I grew up in the 90s, I didn't have cable. All I had was VHS tapes and antenna TV. So yeah, I watched Friends and Seinfeld. What takes more practice to learn how to play, the guitar or the woman? Well, how should I put this? What's an interesting way? A good woman will tell you how to play her. A guitar will never instruct you. You must learn it on your own. If I take that to the next level, a human relationship goes both ways. So a big part of knowing romance is not knowing how to deal with another person, but how that other person knows how to deal with you as well. And so finding compatibility, it's not so much finding it as far as it's developing compatibility, but it goes both ways. And so if you can actually settle down with a partner that not only you're able to understand, but they're able to understand you, it's a lot easier. It's a lot easier if it goes both ways. And so it's probably easier to, I wouldn't say there's no mastery of women. Like women aren't a category that you can master. You can know an individual woman, and you can have some basic ideas of how to meet and interact with a category of women, but not how to know them, right? That requires intimacy, which requires shared experiences and things like that. So I don't know. A good relationship, you don't have to master. The other person will help you do that. Sammy Ree, what do you think about romance where one of the main characters longs for their love interest and works towards that? Like Peter Parker and Mary Jane. That's a good one. That's again, the tension is trying to get to the matriculation point. So I think that works pretty well. In fact, I think, Peter Parker's original love interest, I think was Gwen, right? And the blonde one, and she dies in the old comics. And so that's a good tragic end. I think what's more interesting is something like Wolverine and Jean Grey, though, which is like, it's the forbidden love angle. That tends to have a little bit more interest, I think, to me. Peter Parker and Mary Jane, it feels very wholesome, and there's nothing wrong with that. But you have to have some reason why it can't really happen. And that's a little bit tougher, like especially in just an American setting where people can just be together if they want to. Like I think in the movies, he just like rejects her at the end of one of the movies, maybe the first one, because it's like, it's too dangerous for you to be with me. Nobody liked that. Um, and that was just kind of thrown in at the end so that they couldn't be together. Um, so I don't know. I think they're fine. That's like the main way that you can have something happen. I think if you have somebody working towards trying to woo a woman, and it goes at least a male, and it goes really far, sometimes that lowers the attractiveness of the male because he starts to seem like he's, if you're trying too hard to get her, then your status must be low, right? Usually you want that to go both ways, that there's, eventually the interest comes around. There could be an interesting story there where like, a man's not used to having to try really hard, and then he has to try really hard, and then he finally works towards actually getting the girl. And that could be part of a growth arc. But if it just goes on too long, then it's, again, I have to say like Ross and Rachel, but you get this idea of like this kind of simping male that no one would really be attracted to. Anyway, so that's that. But I don't know, it could be a valid fantasy. Let's see here. Super chat from Jack Cool. I made a comic-like story in 2017, but I haven't had anyone skilled give feedback. Would you be willing to give me yours? If so, where can I send it to? Unfortunately, I really appreciate the super chat. I can't look at unpublished manuscripts for legal reasons. The legal reason, in case you're wondering, is that if you send me a story and I look at it, and somewhere down the line I write a similar story, that opens me up to a lawsuit. Which is why you hear this. Like, for legal reasons, I can't look at unpublished manuscripts. I can only look at that if we entered into some contractual relationship as an editor. But I don't, because I do publish my own stuff. I don't want someone to think like, well, I sent him my story and then he did something similar later. It's just, it's a legal protection. But if you make it public, like if you publish it on some level, then anyone can give you feedback. So like if you put up on your website at least some samples or something, then it's fine, So I don't usually look at unpublished manuscripts, and it's mostly a legal thing. Let me work back up here. People talk about me being a weeaboo. Always a little bit, yeah. Right? Nothing wrong with that. Let's see here. What do you think about the NPC meme? I think it's a very effective meme, right? Great memes point to the truth, and the truth is that people get into groupthink very, very easily, and so I think the NPC meme it's a great and very effective meme because it points to the truth, which is that lots of people don't really think for themselves. And then kind of like God hardening Pharaoh's heart, one of the things I've seen, everybody leapt to attack, these kids who were had a drum beat in their face, and then got doxxed by the media and all this stuff. Everybody was attacking them, and then when the real story came out, they just doubled down. They just said like, no, I refuse to believe that these kids aren't racist. I know that they're racist in their heart. And it's like, oh my God, there's no fixing some people. They really do just react according to how they're programmed to. I'm not going to say people on the right don't do the same thing, but it's so obvious when the mainstream media does it, and everybody just like immediately says the same thing. Can you recommend a couple primarily romance books with an element of fantasy? The tips are kind of abstract for me, but some concrete examples might be useful. I have to stop and think about kind of fantasy that has maybe a lot of romance in it. It's hard for me to think about that, because usually the fantasy is always like a B story. Like there's a lot of romance in Wheel of Time, but I don't find it all that effective. And the books that I could think of that have romance as like the primary thing, I have a hard time remembering them because the main plot maybe wasn't strong enough. So I'd have to get back to you. Maybe I'll make a video that recommends some of these things. Dune actually has the book Dune actually has a great little romance in it. It's actually a really really good one, because it's I don't know, it has all the limitations of this real political environment in it. It's actually a good example of that. Um, do you think it's better to be explicit with sex when you have that ability, i.e., in movies and comic books? Depends on your audience, and depends on what you're willing to accept as a consequence of that. In genre fantasy, explicit sex isn't really a thing most people want to go for, and when you do it, it's usually less explicit than what you'd get in straight up erotica or something like that, or paranormal romance or something like that. So if you're doing paranormal romance, then yeah, you could totally be explicit as long as it's not young adult, right? Comic books, it depends on how much, what effect you want that to have. If you're reading a comic and you see explicit sex and it shocks you as a part of the audience, then you probably shouldn't have done it, right? But if it's just kind of goes along with what's there, like if you're reading something like Crossed, which is just completely horrible and horrific beginning to end, the bizarre raping sex isn't a big deal, right? Or Berserk, if you want to go the manga side, like the sex isn't that shocking. In fact, I think I don't have the first manga here. I think the first manga begins with like him having sex with the demon and blowing her up with his hand cannon, which kind of sets the tone for like the first three manga volumes of Berserk. It's about setting the tone for everything that's going to happen. And it's about introducing you to the character and the world. Someone says that I'm not getting an answer tonight. I'm sorry. You answer it again with a tag and I'll get to the question. Hearing Rosario plus vampire come out of David Stewart's mouth is incredibly surreal. It was surreal watching it, and it's like, I should probably never mention that like me, and then like I had another friend later he's like, oh yeah, I watched this, and I was like, it's okay, dude, we watched it too, because it was such a dumb thing to watch, but we ended up watching the entire series. Like, it's so weird. Whatever. It's way over the top and it's funny and it's effective in its own weird little way. Do you think I can write serious adult stories but fade sex scenes to black scene break to skip them, or is that a requirement of the genre? Depends on the genre, right? If you're writing adult oriented fantasy, you do not have to write explicit sex. In fact, it's fine if you skip it. A lot of grimdark fantasy just kind of skips it. A lot of dark fantasy skips it. So, yeah, I mean, you want to allude to the fact that they're maybe going to do it, but you just kind of can skip over that. Lots of fantasy does it. So you don't have to fade to black. Some books are explicit, some are not. It just kind of depends on what effect you want, where you want the focus to be. If you really want to titillate people, obviously, you want to be explicit. But if you're wanting to avoid that titillation because the titillation will upset some people, then you just skip it. Straight razor came in the mail today. +5 to my manliness. Yeah, they're cool. I usually use like a straight razor to get the edging on here and here about once a week. Kind of edge the beard down. When I didn't wear a beard, I used to shave pretty much with a straight razor for a long time. And then I just kind of switched to a safety razor because it's way quicker. What do you think of authors, usually genre authors, turning out novels? Do you see value in it? Quantity versus quality question. I don't think it's a valid... So, Sunset Boulevard, I don't think that's a valid dichotomy. Quality, and the point is to have lots of quality and lots of quantity. Those two things are not in opposite to one another. The people who churn out novels know how to write, is generally how it works, right? Like Michael Moorcock can churn out novels and they're all good. Stephen King can churn out novels and some of them are good, right? Most of them are good, really, in a way. So churning out novels is not a bad thing at all, especially if you're really hitting your audience. Some guys in the indie book world really maybe overdo it in the sense that they are coming out with books where nothing happens and they're not really about anything. That's when you know that you're not really hitting quality. Like I would rather not release a book than release a book that just doesn't say or do anything important, right? I would never want to release a Wheel of Time book 8 where like nothing happens. That's a waste of the time to write, and it's kind of a waste of the reader's time. It's just milking the reader. Is that a dual rectifier in the background? Yes, that's a 3-channel dual rec. The new ones have like you can turn off one of the rectifiers to cut the power. That's an old 100-watt one. The 2-channel ones from the 80s are probably a little more sought after, but I don't think they're any better than that one. I think most people think the older dual recs are better. They're wired the same way. I think they think the older ones are better because the tubes are more broken in. If you play an app with new tubes, it sounds way different than when you should put 20 or 30 hours on the tubes. When you get about 20, 30 hours in on the tubes, they start to break in and have a lot warmer, better sound. What do you think about some people who want to see Kylo Ren and Rey become a couple by the end of the sequel trilogy? I would like to see that. Why not? I would like to see Rey... Yeah, I'd like to see them get together. I think they should. Why not? Hey man, love your stuff. I'm getting a German razor. Could you discuss Rand more? Heck, a full video would be awesome. Yeah, we can do Rand as just like another video. Ayn Rand, there's so much to say. There's so much to say about Ayn Rand. She's an interesting person. She wrote interesting books. She had interesting ideas. A feminist and MGTOW romance, is that enough tension? And if somebody was right, that's what your thoughts would be. So if you had a feminist and a MGTOW, boy, they're going to not like each other. However, what would have to happen for them to matriculate is they would have to, first of all, the MGTOW would have to view the woman differently than what he would normally classify women as and change his stance. And then the feminist would also have to stop being a feminist in order to appreciate the MGTOW man. So they both have to significantly change by the end of the story for them to get together and have you be convinced by it. Let's see here. What did I miss? Oh, couple super chats. Sorry, these users pop up to the top. Would you ever debate a Marxist? I don't think there's a point, right? If you actually, you can, but I have, like in written format, I have verbally, like many times. There's not a whole lot of point. Like the older I get, the more I think people that want to debate are people that, especially if they're Marxists, they either are horrible people because they believe it or they don't know anything. And both of those people you can't really debate with, because the people who don't know anything, everything that you say is going to come off as a lie. And the people who actually know everything about Marxism are straight up evil. So why would you want to debate with them? Like you're not going to change the heart of an evil man except like through divine intervention. And if you try to educate a straight up stupid person, chances are they're not going to believe anything you say because they have an emotional attachment to the idea of Marxism. There's not a whole lot of point. Ever come across Yandere stories in your life? No. Thank you for the super chat, but I don't think so. I think I missed another one. Irony of gay roms, not forbidden love presently. Gay romances. Okay. I don't write them and I don't read them. Obviously, some people like them. Somebody told me once that gay romance is read mostly by women. And there's a thing in Japan called yaoi light novels and like yaoi manga. And if you don't know what that is, here's what it is. It's gay romance. And usually there's a couple archetypes. There'd be like a strong male and a more passive male, and they have a gay relationship. But it's read predominantly by heterosexual women, which is very weird to think about. I don't know, obviously I don't know everything there's to know. Like I don't know why women find that particularly interesting, but there's a lot of women who do. So a lot of gay romance, I guess, is read by women, not by gay men. There are probably gay men who read it, but gay men tend to be just act like men as far as like what their preferences are. So gay pornography is a big thing because men tend to be more into explicit pornography than romance novels. So that's just a weird one to think about, right? gay men don't have like women's minds. They don't act like women. They still act like men, right? Even if they're, act like very effeminate men, they tend to still have consumption habits that are like men. Just something that I've kind of noticed from marketing. If you wanted to have a gay romance in a novel, here's the caution, is that some people are not going to like that. This is just an optionality argument. I'm not making an argument against writing gay romance or having gay romance if that's really what you want to have a story about, or that people wouldn't find that story interesting. But it's just an optionality thing, is that a gay reader can still enjoy a heterosexual romance, in my experience, because there's still understanding and attachment. It's still about a relationship. They could still understand and enjoy a heterosexual romance. But a heterosexual reader who's very, not comfortable with gay relationships may close the book. And so the optionality is going to be in favor of heterosexual relationships. This is why I think you have lots of people complain about, Hollywood doesn't have enough gay relationships on screen. And whenever they have a gay relationship, it like tanks the movie. And that's because a lot of people don't want to see it. So a lot of heterosexuals are not interested in it. A lot of homosexuals, are not that interested in either. It's just an optionality thing. So if you're going to have gay romance, I'm not going to say you can't or you shouldn't or anything like that. But there's some people who are going to immediately reject your work simply because of that content. So even if you are interested in writing about gay or lesbian or transgender characters, it's something that you need to know that there's going to be a big portion of a potential audience that's not going to like it. And depending on what genre you're in, it's not going to be a big deal at all. So if you're writing in paranormal romance or something like that, then having a gay relationship really won't set you back at all if that's what you want to have, because the audience tends to be a lot more accepting and it tends to enjoy those more. If you're writing sci-fi, maybe. If you're writing fantasy, you might have a lot of people turn off from it. That's just how it is. And if you're writing, crime novels or something, then you might have a lot of people just shut the book if they come across a gay romance. That's just how it is, Sammy Reese says, yaoi isn't read by women, it's read by 14-year-old girls. Okay, I stand corrected, right? I stand corrected. And actually, okay, I'm going to tell you a true story. So I was a band director, right? Like, I haven't been a public school teacher this year or last year because I decided to stay home with my kids because my wife could work less hours. She could work 4 days a week and make the same amount of money. So that was an easy switch for us. I caught a couple of my girls, students reading and looking together at a yaoi manga. And I knew immediately what it was. And I said, you should not have that in school. I'm trying to remember. I said something like, yaoi is not for school. And they looked at me like, he knows what this is. And it's like, I'm trying to remember what I said to them. I said, the internet's a dark place and I am a shadow, or something like that. That was very comical coming from a teacher. And so they hid the yaoi light novel. And like, their parents probably didn't know that they have that, but it's one of those things that, it's appealing to like 14-year-old girls for some reason. And those girls were normal girls. They were a little bit, into Japanese stuff. That's fine. Let me look back up and see if I missed some stuff. Straight razors are cool. Batman and Catwoman is a love-hate on and off relationship, and that's that. It's going on for decades now, yeah. They were going to get married, and it's like, psych, can't get married. All right, Jock Cool says it's published free. The whole thing is published, and it's not a manuscript. Okay, well, send me a link or email me a link, and I'll take a look at it. So the person asking about, can I look at your stuff? Yeah, email me a link, I'll take a look if it's already up. I don't want to look at stuff that hasn't been published. There's just some legal complications to that. Monster Masume. I think I know what that is, but I'm not sure, so I don't know how to answer. How do I make a romance B story feel authentic and unrushed in my film? I'm worried on how to space it out throughout the story. What would you suggest? Well, each time you write a scene, so screenplays have to be really efficient. I've written 3 or 4 screenplays, and this is something I learned. Each scene, you need to have a plot goal for that scene, and you need to have a character goal, and you need to have, so you need to figure out what has to happen in that scene. So you have a scene like, okay, this is the scene where the 2 characters go here and do this. Have a secondary goal. Okay, well, we need them to be able to have something romantic maybe to say. So you just fit in some dialogue where they maybe have some kind of connection over something early on, and then later you develop that into it. And there's lots of ways you can do it. You can have one character awkwardly say something, and that invokes a lot of pathos. So like, especially with male characters, if he says something it's kind of like a bad pickup line, and the girl shuts him down a little bit, invokes a lot of pathos, but it also sets people's expectations up. You do something like that early in the film, and then later on, that becomes an endearing quality, like the bad pickup line, and maybe they're able to finally like express emotions, or you have that, and then you also have the conflict. So it's like, I want them to have some sexual tension and a connection, but I also want them to have some conflict over something. And so in the course of that event, whatever it's going to be, that's what you have. So like if they're secret agents and they're on a job, right? So you have the connection be something that's somewhat playful or flirtatious, but then you have them have an argument about how they're going to actually manage their little infiltration heist or something like that. Or you have somebody make a mistake or do something rash that the other person has to get them out of trouble, and so then they argue about it and they have a little bit of a fight. But you've set up all the expectations, which is these people have some amount of sexual tension, but they don't get along that well, or they have some kind of problem with the way the other person does things. And then throughout the course of that, you slowly can resolve the tension part and set it up so they can actually begin a relationship. And you also continue to drop in little connections. And so you can have in a scene, maybe they're back at the girl's apartment after the heist, after the super, they've stolen some data plans, and the guy notices something that's like a music box that's like what his mom had, and he brings it up, but the girl doesn't realize that that's a connection, but you realize it, and the audience, it's a connection. And then later that becomes another thing, like maybe he gives her a gift that goes with that, and she's very surprised that he actually took the time to think about her, and then that changes her perception of him from being somebody who's very callous and brash to somebody who's actually maybe cares about her and actually maybe thinks about her. And so then that's going to color what goes on after that. So each scene, if you drop in something little by little that happens that way, eventually you get it set up to where maybe you have a big conflict. I'm imagining like a super secret agent movie where like he one character finally has to go save another at great risk to themselves, and that's when they finally realize they have feelings for each other. It's like part of some big plot moment that's important, and that's probably how I would do it. You just gotta, each scene that they have together, you gotta have a little bit of dialogue that exposes their personality, their virtue, their compatibility, and maybe hints at their feelings. A little bit of flirting, maybe if it's awkward at first, and then it becomes less awkward as you go. That sort of stuff. What separates a character? $10 super chat. Let me get this one real quick. Thank you very much, Zarency. Love the streams. Thank you. I wanted to know, what's your opinion of having all your characters have a degree of bisexuality? Not necessarily from the sex aspects, but more from the relationships between the characters. There's nothing wrong with it if that's what you want to have. My only thing would be, first of all, your audience may have a different reaction to it. I remember reading this really awful fantasy novel by Clive Barker called Imagica, where basically all the characters had some degree of that, and it kind of just reflected the author's attitude and not really what to me is reality. You have to think sometimes audiences are uncomfortable, even if they have some amount of bisexuality a reader does. He might be not comfortable wanting to think about that in a book. And so for me as a reader, I might be like, is there a reason everybody's bisexual? Right? Because in my real life, most people are not, and I'm not. So I tend to, with my theory of mind, I tend to think other people are like me. That's kind of natural. So maybe there's a reason that they're all bisexual. Maybe there's a society that has that. Like if it's some kind of take on, ancient Greek society where there's certain kinds of homosexual relationships that are permitted or not permitted, or the way the Romans kind of dealt with that, then it's a little bit more interesting or believable. But if you have it kind of set in our time and place, then maybe it just comes off that all these people are kind of weird and not normal. But I don't know, if you frame it right, then you could totally make it convincing even for people who aren't into that. But if you're writing in a genre where that's normal, which even science fiction, it's kind of normal. Like ever since Robert Heinlein did stuff with that, it's probably pretty normal. If you're writing in any kind of romance-heavy genre, it's not going to be thought of as too weird, right? Even stuff like Vampire Chronicles had different amounts of that. There was kind of gay undercurrents always going through it. So yeah, you can have different degrees of it. It's going to be more or less out of place depending on the genre, though. Yeah. So that's my Film Girl says, thank you for replying. It's going to help me a lot. I'm glad to help. So hopefully Zarency, hopefully that answers your question. It really depends on your genre. So look at your genre, and if you see like a lot of that in the genre that you want to write in, then go for it if that's what you want to have. And even if it's not in there, you may find like a little niche audience that really kind of digs that or really connects with that, because that's somewhat reflective of who they are, and that's fine. You're going to nail it, right? So I don't know. I guess that's the other piece, is that it's okay to do it even if no one else does it. No one else does it, you can still do it. You'll be the only person who does it. Don't listen to the naysayers and say you can't do something. You can do anything you want. You may find like a really niche audience that's really into like high fantasy, but there's bisexual characters throughout it. That's just a thing that's part of the universe. Everyone's bisexual. A lot of people might dig that. Even people who are normally heterosexual might find that kind of titillating. So there's always an audience for everything. Don't be deterred. It's just, if you're going by what's already there, then a lot of people would say, hey, fantasy, you can't have all that. It just depends what you want to do. I've been from another super chat from Edo Hikima. Thank you for the 20 euros. I really appreciate it. I've been watching your book crafting, story crafting, and all the Writestreams. It has been brilliantly informative. Thank you. You were most welcome. I really appreciate the super chat. And thanks for stopping by and chatting with me. It means a lot to me. You still see some Chinese talk about how efficient a planned economy is. Efficient isn't always efficient. Now, this is an interesting thing. So, you can create a horribly inefficient economy that becomes magically efficient when like the economy collapses, because if all the farmers are growing the same thing in an area and then there's like a bug that wipes it out, you're kind of screwed. And that's kind of what happens in a normal capitalistic sense. But if you have somebody that's like, you're going to do shoes and you're going to grow wheat and you're going to do this, and yeah, it's all inefficient, and then like a disaster happens and it's like, well, our community still has all the stuff we need, and all of a sudden it can become efficient. But it's usually not by design. It's not efficient by design, it's efficient by accident. Where do I find your email address? Stu, S-T-U, at dvspress.com or davidvstewart.com. Either one works. So that's my email address. You can always find me there. Romance in my books suck. I'm not exactly a good writer for love scenes. I'd probably just make romance scenes with naked people. Might get the point across better. Or just skip it. Like if you really feel like you're out of your league, you can skip it. Or you can learn to do it. So just look at what other people do. Pick up a genre romance novel, right? Now, I'm not into romance, but I've read romance novels to kind of figure out what's in them and like what's good about them. You find that the focus on the sex scene is really takes a back seat to the focus on developing a relationship. What people want is that the sex is just the point where the relationship, takes the next step. It's not something that's titillating in and of itself, although it can be. Especially in, like, if you read erotica, a lot of people try to transpose erotica into other kinds of fiction, saying, well, I'll just add some really explicit sex, and it can feel out of place. But you never know. It could work. What do you think of the future appetite for reading novels in the next 15 to 30 years? I don't know. I can't even begin to answer that question properly. I think we're kind of reaching an ebook saturation point where there's not going to be too many more readers of ebooks. So I don't know. I think people might be more interested in like quality books that they can leave on their shelves in the future. Because that's Lindy. Lindy is quality hardback books. So one of the things I might be looking into doing is getting everything going in hardback, so that there's permanent copies that are nice to hold. Reads all your... What was your actual question, Jonathan Nichols? I didn't see it. I'm sorry. The chat goes by fast, and sometimes I miss stuff. You got to tag me in it, or I might miss it. And I probably did miss it. So write my name, and then I'll see it. Sorry, I missed it. I don't know what you asked. Ask it again, and maybe I'll get it. All right, Jack Cool. Rip Social Galactic. Yeah. It's too bad. But my thought is probably they were going to run into hosting issues, so they have to think of literally having everything be separate. That's where we're going with the internet, is that if you don't want to toe the line, you have to have everything be separate, including separate physical servers. You can't rent server space. You can't use an ISP to set up virtual servers or things like that, because they'll just, the first sign of controversy, they'll knock you off of it. Or the banks will say, you need to stop hosting this person, or we'll stop banking with you. And so they kill your contract or things like that. So it'd have to be, you have your own separate physical servers. And eventually it's going to be like, you won't be able to get your traffic even directed towards your servers unless you do it. And then those could be a separate internet entirely for everyone that's not on the left, is what's going to happen. It's kind of funny to think about that way. I might write a story about it. Sorry, I'm a little congested today. It's raining, and for whatever reason, something's blooming. It's making my nose itchy. Random question. If I post my film on YouTube, for example, and I gave you the link, would you be able to watch it and maybe give your thoughts? Absolutely. Absolutely. Totally, if it's published. Any thoughts on Vic Mignogna? Mignogna? I'm trying to remember how to pronounce his name. Being Me Too'd. I haven't looked into it in enough detail. Here's my general thoughts on Me Too stuff. Somebody being accused of some sort of sexual impropriety of the past, or being abusive, or something like that. It's a case by case by case by case thing. There is no blank. So guilty until proven guilty. That's the way the Me Too'ers want it to be, until it turns around on them. Like with what's her name? Oh God, what's her name? Asia Argento. It's like, oh yeah, I was a Me Too'er, and it turns out I was having sex with an underage boy. Whoa, how about that? People tried to forget that one real fast. So I can't make any judgment on an individual case unless I know a lot about it, and I just don't know a lot about that one. So it has to be kind of case by case by case, is the way things have to be. Okay. Jonathan Nichols, I wanted to know your thoughts about using a romantic motivation as a call to action in a hero's journey. It's a great one, but the hero has to grow out of that. So, the hero wants to impress the girl, or he wants to go along with the girl in an adventure. Eventually, he needs to grow out of that and have his own motivations. So you see this in the movie Akira. And in Akira, the main protagonist, which ones? Not kind of the whoever the main protagonist is. There's he only gets involved in this revolution because he's into the girl. He has a romantic interest in her, and so that kind of gets him out the door. So the call to glory can be just like, I want to be with this girl. I'm really into this girl, and so you kind of follow her out the door into the grand adventure. And it's been done in other ones, but Akira is what came to mind, I guess, because we've been talking about weeaboo stuff tonight. But yeah, so that I think it's a great one. It's a great motivation. If you think about somebody who's maybe, like in Akira, he's kind of a bad boy. Somebody who's just not, he's kind of Sigma. He's not interested in what the world wants or what the army wants or any kind of grand motivations. Kind of how Luke Skywalker was originally supposed to be. Before he got like dialed in the final versions of the script and then making the very first Star Wars movie. He was originally supposed to be a bit more neutral. Like there was a scene that I think got cut that Mark Hamill talks about from time to time where Luke was talking about joining the Empire, which made him a more neutral character. So that's what, in fact, actually that's what gets Luke out the door now that I think about it. Because he sees Princess Leia and then R2-D2 turns off the recording and he's like, "What? Bring her back!" It's like, God, she was hot. Let's see. Oh, is there a fair maiden who needs saving? And that kind of gets him out the door to go see Ben to see this message from Leia. So he's the romantic interest is actually part of Luke's initial interest in it. He was thinking of leaving the girl at home and going out to slay the dragon to protect her. There's nothing wrong with that. Yeah. That works as well. But on some level, we kind of want a certain amount of growth from one of those people. You probably want like the girl to grow and become part of the adventure, or for the hero to have some kind of change in motivation about it, or the hero to go back and realize like things are bad, like in his hometown, or the girl, I would try to add more tension into it, because there's no inherent tension in like, I'm going to leave my girl at home and go fight a dragon, or I'm going to go fight the Empire or something. Like if Luke had a girlfriend in Star Wars, like there'd be no romantic tension. So it has to be something that hasn't matriculated and needs to have tension added into it as you go. Let's look at some other questions. You mentioned you're a Robert E. Howard fan. What are your thoughts on Solomon Kane? I like him. What makes him a good character? Mainly that he's interesting and that he's a good vehicle for like vicarious fantasy. It's cool to imagine like being Solomon Kane. Same thing with like Conan. Any of those heroic characters. It's really fun to watch characters like kick ass and be super strong, and you want to be super strong. You want to be Conan. What do you think of from Unicorn on the Cob? What do you think of conspiracy theories? Are there any you think are true? So, I've talked about this on numerous occasions. Most conspiracy theories, just on the human level, are unlikely to be true because there'd be too many people that have to keep a secret. There are some which could be true because there's not a lot of people who have to keep a secret. So the JFK assassination, there's a lot of conspiracy theories that go around that. That's one that I put in the possible category. LBJ, who I don't need to get into it too much, but he was a well-known crook in Texas. And my family was personally involved in getting cheated out of a lot of money from him. This was many decades ago, and my ancestors at this point. But he was well known as a cheat in Texas, having dead people vote from the grave. I don't think it's at all outside the realm of possibility he could have had John F. Kennedy assassinated somehow. I don't think it's at all outside of the realm of possibility that there could have been a conspiracy involved with him, because there's not very many people who would have to have kept that a secret, right? Having somebody killed, that can actually be kept pretty secret. The mafia gets away with stuff like that all the time. And we don't think of it as a conspiracy theory to have some schmo assassinated. But it's a conspiracy theory when someone in government is involved, right? But most things like the flat earth, you could pretty much say that just by the nature of people are terrible at keeping secrets. So it's very unlikely the 100,000 people who would know the earth is flat and are keeping the secret, it's very unlikely they wouldn't keep the secret if the earth was actually flat. Because the number of people who actually know whether the earth is round or flat is an extremely large number. We're talking anybody who's flown at a high altitude. We're talking anybody who's like circumnavigated the globe. You know, everybody who's been into space and back. Everybody who's worked in aeronautics. You know, people who fly commercial airlines would know. There'd be so many people who know the earth is flat and are suppressing the evidence that it's impossible at this point for me to think that that secret has been kept. Or that there's a conspiracy to program people or brainwash them into thinking the earth is flat, especially when they can go out with their eyes and see all kinds of evidence for it. But part of Nuevo skepticism is this is something you'll notice with some people who have conspiracy theories and things like that. It's like if they set up a standard of evidence that can't ever be met, and then if it is met, then they just raise the bar, they just move the goalposts. So most conspiracies aren't true. There's ones that I think are possible, but the question is, how do you prove them? How do you prove that a conspiracy is possible, right? There was a conspiracy, you know, to break into the DNC offices with Nixon and all that. And that was proven because people can't keep secrets. So I don't know. Most conspiracy theories, I think, are bunk. The question is how you want to go about debunking them. And in some cases, you can point to just not a lot of people know about it, so it's possible, but that doesn't mean it's likely. That doesn't mean I think it's at all likely. But I actually find conspiracy theories very interesting because just as a writer, I think it's interesting to think about how you could keep a conspiracy kind of under wraps, like how you would actually do that. And I like the movie Conspiracy Theory with Mel Gibson. That was a cool movie. How can you make a very stoic warrior woman work? Do you soften her up a bit, but be a foil to the male lead, but no little more playful, subtle tone, or do you go the Wonder Woman route? I had a stoic female lead in Water of Awakening. So the way I did it is I didn't try to make her not feminine. There's just no male lead. And so there's not a whole lot of like ultra masculine foils for her to play off of. And nor is she acting masculine the whole time. I try to have her have like a woman's perspective and a woman's approach to things, but she's kind of put in a position where she has to end up being more combative, being a warrior and fighting. She gradually ends up as a warrior. She's just not a warrior by design. And also she's a mage. Like she has magic at her disposal, and magic makes that a little bit more believable because, you know, women aren't as physically robust as men, so it's harder to believe, you know, a woman will be a really strong warrior, but you give them access to magic and it's like, hey, give a woman a gun and it's a much more even playing field than if she has a sword, right? You know, Sam Colt made him equal. What are some comics you would recommend for comic book writers for the purposes of analysis for craft improvement as well as entertainment? Any of the old Marvel stuff that Stan Lee and Jack Kirby worked on, it's just great to look at because it's been copied a million times. The stories have really held up. So any of the old Jack Kirby and Stan Lee stuff, that's good to look at. I really liked the sort of Conan stuff from the 70s. You know, because if you want to look at fantasy, you can look at like Frank Miller stuff. That's good to look at from a story perspective, but I'm not always like super crazy about it. It depends if you want to be in that superhero genre. If you want to be in that superhero genre, I tend to really like the older stuff, the Bronze Age kind of stuff, maybe Silver Age comics. I have a lot of nostalgia for books from the 90s, but as I go back and read them, I don't think they're quite as good as the older comics as far as story writing goes. And no, the art's good. The art's good. I think art continued to improve up to a point, and I think the art in comics, I like it less now, and there's some reasons for it. I don't want to get too deep into it, but it has a lot to do with just the way that art's organized now. It's less about inking and more about doing like gradient coloring that I just don't end up liking as much as the older style stuff. You know. Film Girl says, thank you. Hope you enjoy it when it's finished. Hope I do too. That's all. That's all. God, help me. So what's the difference between fantasy and high fantasy? High fantasy is a type of fantasy. So high fantasy, there's two ways to look at high fantasy. As a genre, high fantasy usually is involved with a different world that is completely apart from ours. And involves large-scale conflicts. As a setting type, high fantasy is just a world that is not ours, whereas low fantasy is our world, but with fantasy elements, either historical fantasy or like something like Dresden Files, urban fantasy, contemporary fantasy, anything where like you're going between our world, that's kind of low fantasy. Things with like witches, but Harry Potter's low fantasy, for example. Whereas high fantasy tends to deal with higher conflicts. It also tends to deal with other worlds. So usually, high fantasy would be like Lord of the Rings or anything that emulates it, Wheel of Time. Whereas low fantasy would be, Dresden Files or Amber, Books of Amber to a certain extent. Then there's things like heroic fantasy, which would be Michael Moorcock, Robert E. Howard, that kind of stuff. Those are all genres. So fantasy and high fantasy, it's just high fantasy is usually the focus is on some larger conflict, a grand war, saving the world, things like that, rather than heroic fantasy is focused on the character and his goals and what he's doing. So Conan would be heroic fantasy. It's focused on the hero and his immediate goals, whereas high fantasy is like the world is at stake. Can you explain the alpha, beta, sigma, gamma, omega, male? Okay, so there's no set way to talk about this. An alpha male is going to be like the top of a social chain, like the absolute top. James Bond kind of guys. So like if you want to go back to high school, an alpha male would be like, he's the captain of the football team. His girlfriend's the hottest. He can cheat on his girlfriend if he wants to and get any girl, right? Like everybody likes him. Everybody appreciates him. He never seems to be embarrassed. He never seems to do things that set him back. Or when he does, they just kind of roll off of him. The truth is alphas, they just don't, the social awkwardness doesn't get to them. Beta is just normal people, right? So the alpha tends to be like a Chad, right? Gamma is like the virgin. Or an incel. The gamma is the person who's like at the bottom. On the 1 to 10, there's the oppressive one, the one who lords over everyone. Not really, but, depending on the way you look at it. And then the gamma is the guy who's just kind of at the bottom of the totem pole, has trouble getting a girl. Like a beta would just be normal. He'd have a normal girlfriend, normal relationships. He's not the most desirable, but it's not like he's undesired. He just has normal. Beta's normal. Gamma would be the guy who can't get a girl, and is what kind of comes with that lack of social success is a bunch of other things, right? So why are so many authors gammas? Well, they have more time to sit around and write rather than just enjoy their social place, I guess, right? A sigma is somebody who's just rejects the system and just is against the hierarchy in general and just doesn't really participate in it. So if you were going to think like the alpha would be the captain of the football team. The beta is like he's like a linebacker. He's part of the team. He's successful. He has a girlfriend, right? The gamma would be not even like the band nerd, but like the third chair trumpet player in the band, and I was in the marching band, so keep that in mind. And then the sigma would be like the black metal musician who does drugs under the bleachers hoping to get caught. That would be like the sigma male. And then lambda, I think Vox Day was where I got lambda. But Lambda's a gay male, right? So that's how I see it explained. I'm not sure who exactly came up with it, but it's on the internet. It's around. By the way, nobody fits into these categories. It's just a way to think about a concept, right? Nobody's 100% anything, right? Nobody's like 100% alpha. I guarantee you, because I've known dudes that people would think are like the most alpha people on the planet, and they have massive insecurities. They're just not as apparent until you really get to know them. So everybody has things that they're super insecure about. Everybody feels awkward at different times. I've known guys that were millionaires that it's like, oh, this guy scores the chicks constantly. And he's like, man, I hate getting shot down 100 times a night. It's like, that's what he would do to hit on girls, So even millionaires get shot down. Oh, whoops, I missed the super chat from Kaku. I'm sorry. David, I often draft ideas that has too much or transmutate into comedic and absurd tones. Is there a way to use this chaos to develop tension? Yes. So absurdity is a type of tension. So when things are absurd, you can laugh at them. Your laughter is an attempt to alleviate the dissonance. So absurdity always has tension, and comedy always has tension. That's where the comedy comes from. And, comedy could be awkward, I am funny bot, or it can be something that's set up way ahead of time with a certain set of expectations that you define or defy. So, yeah, comedy always has that. The way that you would keep it with tension is that something that starts off as absurdist continues to persist and then becomes a source of real conflict. So if you set up a society where, everybody has to wear a false nose and it's really ridiculous, eventually that becomes a thing that like, we have to get rid of these false noses. And then there's a rebellion that centers around that. That's actually a serious story element that starts as out of something absurdist. So the tension is right there. Anything that's absurd or comedic has tension in it. It's just, if you continue persisting with it, then you can easily make it into story tension. You just have to keep hitting the idea. What about applying that model to females, alpha, beta, gamma stuff? It doesn't apply to women. Women are different from men, and their social hierarchies are different, and their social relationships are different, and much more complex in a lot of ways. So I just wouldn't attempt to do that. Some people do. Some people have another one. There's like the Becky and the Stacy, and I don't know them. So I'd have to look into them, so like Stacy and Becky and that kind of stuff. Where like, there's, the slutty girl who, I'll do a character archetype video on it. The slutty girl who gets lots of male attention, but is disliked by the other women for that reason, and is kind of an outcast because of that. So, and then there's women who constantly reject male attention, but end up kind of on the lower end of the totem pole because they're not able to capture the right male's attention. So, and I don't want to, I don't want to paint women with broad brushes either, but it's just a way of thinking about it, right? Like nobody is really alpha or sigma, right? It's different ways that people act. So when I say that, when I say Patrick Rothfuss writes like a gamma, it's that he's got a perspective of like a sexually frustrated, socially unsuccessful male. Is kind of what I get from his writing. Whereas, somebody else it just wouldn't be like that. It'd be like normal, right? Yeah, it's just generalizations. Just a way to think about it. Anytime you apply those archetypes, it's just a place to start, and then you do it your own way. You make the character unique. You make it do its own thing, and that's how you do it. Am I on Goodreads? I think I am on Goodreads. I don't interact with Goodreads, right? Like I appreciate Amazon reviews. I don't really interact with them. Okay, so it's 8 o'clock. I'm basically out of time. Hopefully I've answered all of your questions about this. It's an extremely rich topic. There's a lot of fun to be had with it. The main takeaway is that most romance occurs through dialogue. That dialogue is characters interacting. And so if you have your characters interact in a very natural way, it's easy to develop tension through that. If you have your characters, if you try to force them into a relationship, that's when it's going to get awkward. If you let them do a lot of talking, it's going to be fine. I think I got all the super chats. I really appreciate the super chats tonight, guys. I really, really do. So Mean Girls, yeah, Mean Girls is kind of secretly a documentary. That kind of expresses some of the problems with like the female hierarchy in those little isolated high school environments. And again, like once you leave high school, there may be actions that are reflective of that, but it's not, it doesn't become your reality. You're not bound by those things, nor are you destined to act like you could be the most awkward 15-year-old boy on the planet. That's not your destiny. You could be whoever you want to be, right? Even if you have to start with a script, like you start talking to girls with a script, which is actually really useful. That's what we used to do way back in the day because we just didn't know how to talk to girls. You're like, what do you say to them? Well, you say this, this, and this. You ask them a personal question, you do this, and then, then you get them to respond, and then you could be awkward later, and it's kind of forgiven because you're on a more casual footing with the girl. But you could start as the most awkward 15-year-old ever, and you could end up wherever you want to be, So I don't think that anybody's destined to be a certain way. You can change your habits. You can do whatever you want. It's just a way of thinking about it. We put things in categories that don't fit neatly in categories all the time. All right. So that's probably it for tonight, guys. I really, really appreciate it. I hope you've had a good time chatting with me. I will see you all next time, I think. And do leave me or email me your suggestions for other topics to talk about. One of these days, I'm gonna start doing some that are just like about an IP, like just Star Wars or just BattleTech or just Warhammer, because I like all those, or just Warcraft or something, and we'll talk about stories and how those have been effective in those as well. So thanks so much, and I'll see you guys next time.